broadcast for shooters, hunters, and gun enthusiasts. This is the Firearms Radio Network. The bandwidth for this episode of Gun Guy Radio is sponsored by Patriot Patch Company. PatriotPatch.co.
Hello and welcome to episode 185 of Gun Guy Radio. This is the podcast that shines a positive light on the firearms lifestyle. I'm your host, Ryan Bachad, and this is your weekly dose of positive firearms talk without the politics. This week, I'm joined by firearms historian and researcher Daniel Waters and Nathaniel F. from the Firearms blog to discuss the saga of Colt firearms. So as always, please consider supporting the Firearms Radio Network by shopping Amazon using our Amazon affiliate link at firearmsradio.tv/Amazon. A portion of your purchase will go towards helping the FRN create awesome pro-gun content like this show. Also, check out the Huckleberry Patch from the Patriot Patch Company, and also check out the Firearms Radio Network t-shirts that are now available for order. So thank you both for coming on. It's been a little while. How you doing?
Doing pretty good. Thanks, Ryan.
How you doing, Daniel?
Oh, I'm doing well. Doing quite a bit of research, of course, mostly for this episode, but
there's a lot of stuff coming up. People are going to really enjoy.
I think they will too. I actually learned some things as well.
So, Nathaniel, any new articles up for you?
Yeah, I will. I'm still working on light rifle. I got part 3 up about a month ago, and so everybody should go check that out. I also have done an article on the CMG3, which is one of the things we're going to talking about some of the design aspects of the CMG3. And, I'm writing every week, so put up double-digit articles every week, so everybody should check all those out, certainly.
I was just checking out your Mosin article. I was quite impressed.
Yeah, it was a bunch of fluff.
But very many valid reasons as why one should love the Mosin.
Oh, sure, yeah, a big important piece of firearms history, and even if the Mauser is better.
Excellent. So with that, we're going to head into the main topic, the Colt saga, with Daniel Waters and Nathaniel F.
Do you shop on Amazon? How about your spouse? Does your mom? Does your company? Why not use the Firearms Radio Network's Amazon affiliate link next time you shop Amazon? Bookmark firearmsradio.tv/Amazon or click through the Amazon link in the right-hand corner of firearmsradio.tv. Get it? Got it? Amazon it.
Now, the Colt saga is one that honestly could fill a book, and I'm sure it probably will in the future, whether it's written by Daniel or Nathaniel, one of the two. And it is, I don't even know how I can describe it. This is probably the most soap opera, maybe, of the firearms world.
Certainly, one could make that case. I mean, it was definitely a soap opera, even going back to Samuel Colt's era. Some of the best books on the topic right now are The Colt Armory by Ellsworth S. Grant, and there's also R.L. Wilson's Colt, an American Legend. However, even in the course of researching this episode, I even found some mistakes and some oversights. And really, there's just so much going on that it's easy to miss the details. And I'm almost worried that I'm not going to be able to adequately cover all of this material tonight for you, but I'm going to do my best. And
well, it seems like, and one thing, reading over the show notes before we get started in the history of it, it really seemed like to me one overarching theme was the fact that the Colt name carries a lot more weight than maybe the actual products they were delivering at any given time.
Well, again, they say the Colt legend, and there is a lot of legend there. And I think there's a lot of a feeling even by Colt aficionados that the company has been bigger than it actually was. And again, this will come up later in my narrative about essentially that Colt has huge name recognition, but not necessarily the sales to back it up.
So basically, leading us into the history you have written down here, Colt really hit its stride in terms of mass marketing, being out as a major player, starting about World War I, right?
Well, yes, Colt made about $21.5 million in profits in the years between 1914 and 1918. By the end of the war, they delivered something like 425,000 1911 pistols, more than 150,000 of their revolvers, like the Model 1917, which was their new service chambered for 45 ACP. They had made under license more than 13,000 Maxim and Vickers machine guns for the Army. And there was 10,000 of their own Browning machine guns, the 1917. At the same time, Colt had subcontracted thousands upon thousands of additional pistols and machine guns through Marlin Rockwell, which they had passed along the Model 1895 potato digger, which Marlin then proceeded to modify into a straight piston design for aircraft and tanks. Remington UMC was making the 1911 pistol. Winchester ended up making the majority of the early 1918 Browning automatic rifles. So, there was a lot of prestige there. And so at the end of the war, they had a cash reserve in excess of about $5.5 billion. However, they started spending through this surplus as the president at the time of Colt, William Skinner, made the decision that, well, we have all these commercial back orders because of the war. We're going to go ahead and just honor the pre-war prices. And this is despite the fact that employee wages and material costs had already risen at the time. There was also the decision to start trying to branch out their manufacturing base from small arms. They first started trying to produce adding machines or counting machines. They branched out into commercial dishwashers. The counting machine venture was a costly failure almost immediately. They also added a hard plastics manufacturer in 1920, and this is going to come into play later. And they also ended up adding an electrical device manufacturer in 1923. Around this time, in 1921, the vice president of the company, Samuel Stone, rose to the level of president. And so while military orders were low during this period, their small arms production was sustained primarily by foreign contracts from Central and South America. So going on to the start of the Great Depression, Colt had about 1,600 people on their payroll. And of those, 120 of them had been there 25 years or more, and 10 of those had been employed there at least 50 years. And the general feeling at the time at Colt was if you lasted your first year at the company, you were pretty much guaranteed a job for life. Even once you got too infirm to do something like hand fitting or polishing, or if you couldn't operate the machinery anymore, if you'd been loyal to the company, they were going to keep you on one way or another, whether sweeping floors, running the elevator, being some sort of greeter. You pretty much had a job for life. And there were multiple generations of people that worked there. The father would work there. He'd recommend his son to work there, and so on and so forth. I mean, even into the 1920s, there were people there that actually worked there ever since the Hartford plant had started. There was, I think the record was 77 years of continuous work at Colt's. Now, with the beginning of the Great Depression, of course, orders fell off. The economy was shrinking. Yet President Stone did his best to keep on as many people on the payroll as he could. They managed to only cut about 400 positions, even though they probably could have stood to get rid of about 200 more. So what they did to keep people on the payroll was they reduced hours, reduced shifts. However, they still kept the same day rates or the same piece rate pay rates as had been before the Depression. In fact, even the company's executives reduced their own salaries by 10%. Stone also made the decision to keep paying dividends to the company's shareholders. And so, while this was all very generous, this bled the company's cash reserves down to about $2.9 million. Well, orders finally began to rebound in 1933. However, this is when the company also started having issues with labor relations. You had the passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act, which led to the National Recovery Administration and various schemes that was basically trying to push U.S. industry into unionized labor. And the company had its own employee organization at the time, but this was considered basically a tame organization. It's more of a showpiece. However, in 1934, that organization was completely replaced. The employees voted to to replace it, and there were 3 workers' organizations that were formed up, and these folks were loosely affiliated with the American Federation of Labor, what we now know as the AFL. And so when these organizations attempted to negotiate pay increases with President Stone, Stone was having nothing of it. And so the AFL decided, well, we're going to force the issue. And there was a walkout strike in March of 1935. And this drew all sorts of attention from the National Labor Relations Board, the National Recovery Administration. Definitely the AFL's national organization was pushing to have Colt punished. As a matter of fact, they even got Senator Gerald Nye, who was a liberal Republican from Montana, to try to pull the National Recovery Administration's Blue Eagle accreditation. And if they'd lost the Blue Eagle accreditation, Colt wouldn't be eligible for any government contracts, conceivably killing the company. And as it was, if you're familiar with Senator Nye, he was very much an isolationist. He was very much you could almost say he was anti-military, anti-gun. I believe he had a hand in the National Firearms Act of 1934. He had an ongoing Senate subcommittee that was investigating the munitions industry in the United States, basically blaming the merchants of death and the industrialists and the bankers for forcing the U.S. into World War I, if not actually starting the war itself.
Well, and one thing you're going to notice, kind of overarching in terms of this also is Colt's relationship with government contracts. That seems to be a theme that really is repeated a lot in Colt's history.
Right. The whole dependency on government contracts and really their entire negative relationship with their employee unions. It's going to come up again and again and again. At least in terms of losing their Blue Eagle accreditation, this threat was quickly made moot because the Supreme Court ruled in a separate case that the National Recovery Administration's existence was unconstitutional. So that saved them there. However, this whole episode basically made Colt firmly in the crosshairs of Senator Nye, and he would drag them before his subcommittee multiple times over the following months.
Now, during the 30s, I remember hearing a lot about the unions and stuff like that, and sometimes there was quite a bit of violence with these movements. Now, did that happen with Colt as well?
Oh, yes. It was actually quite violent. It got to the point where Colt was actually putting in sleeping facilities inside the factory grounds so employees wouldn't have to cross the picket line because basically the scabs, as the unions like to call people that cross the picket line, they were getting attacked. Their families were being attacked. And as the strike dragged on, a certain amount of this wasn't even so much the Colt strikers themselves, but outside agitators sponsored by the AFL, fellow travelers of sorts. And actually, an unaffiliated trade unionist decided he was going to force the issue in late May, and he was going to bomb the factory and President Stone's own home. But for whatever reason, the plot to bomb the factory was abandoned, mainly because there was just too much police presence. I think the rumors of the potential attack got out. However, Stone's home was successfully attacked. It evidently blew out much of the front of his house, at least the windows. And in this act of violence, that was pretty much the final straw among even Colt's own strikers. Colt's representative on the AFL, evidently the bomber went to him, I think, hoping to maybe brag about what he had just done. But the response by the Colt employee was, "Oh my God, this couldn't have been one of our people. We need to go visit Stone right now and apologize." and within a week of the bombing, the strike was over. And that kind of goes to show you how popular Stone was among his own employees, even the ones that disagreed with him. But that was pretty much the end of it, as far as there seems to be in the narrative of some of the histories that Stone almost had a broken heart over this issue. While he was against the unionization or the organized unions, he did care for his own employees, and he knew that in the future, it was inevitable that his workforce was going to be unionized. Now, following up, Colt had other issues. You had the Great Flood of 1936, which damaged the factory. There was the Great New England Hurricane of 1938. Again, damages the factory. Early in 1938, Colt's vice president Fred Moore was killed in an accident during the testing of Browning's unfinished 37mm automatic cannon design. Moore had been recognized by Browning back when Browning first, I want to say it was back when Browning first brought the potato digger design to Colt. And through Browning's sponsorship, Moore quickly rose through the ranks from just being a tool room employee, and he ultimately became works manager and, of course, vice president. And at the time, Moore was considered to be one of the potential successors to President Stone, and there were a couple others that Stone just simply outlived, whether through natural causes or, in the case of Moore, an accident. But despite these strategies, Colt managed to rebuild its cash reserves in the years leading to World War II. However, as predicted, the Armory employees successfully unionized under the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America, the UE, in 1941, and they were even having labor disputes on the cusp of the war and, frankly, through the war itself. Although Colt was awarded the E for Excellence in 1942, and I believe there was a follow-up E, the increased cost, the military contract price renegotiations, actual contract reductions and cancellations, Colt started posting monthly losses starting in July of 1943. They were losing money on the war. And this issue was further compounded when the Army cut its order for 50 caliber machine guns by 40% starting in January of 44. Colt tried to make up some of its lost funds by selling off its electrical division, but still the bleeding continued. And so with all of this uncertainty with delivery schedules, the uncertainty of how much money they were losing, President Stone's health was suffering. And frankly, there's some that suggested that there was a great deal of pressure from inside and outside the company, including the government itself, for him to just pack up and leave. And with no successors within the company, again, Moore and others had died, Stone looked from outside the company, and he picked Graham Anthony, who was the president of Vita Root. I believe Vita Root was a counting machine company, and convinced him to succeed him for a period of 5 years, starting in April of 1944. And to give you an idea of how bad things were, again, with labor relations, on the first day at Colt, the newly minted President Anthony was met with a new strike threat. And the negotiator, well, actually was an arbitrator, came in and was basically listing out the demands. And Anthony evidently made the comments like, I've been here 5 minutes and you're telling me there's going to be a strike? And, unless I do all these things you're telling me to do. And it said, well, yes. I said, well, they can go to hell. And he proceeded to walk out of his office. And so the big issue at that time was the differences in the pay rates between the piecework employees, the fitters, the polishers, some of the others that were basically being paid for every item that they processed versus the workers that got flat day rates. And these were the folks that were basically machine operators. And, it's like no matter, how many pieces they went through, they were going to get paid the same. And again, this is another thing that will keep coming up. Basically your more experienced employees are going to be the piecework pay rate folks. And as you start bleeding away your experienced employees, the company's ability to make some of their products suddenly disappears.
Well, and one thing, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me like, back at this time, at least with Colt, I don't know if this was the case with the other companies that were in existence then, but it seems like it wasn't gun people who were put into the positions of power at these companies. It was, people from other industries. They may not have any experience with the manufacture and sales of firearms, but they may have a good business sense. And nowadays, I feel like people that are put into positions of power at companies, they tend to look for not only a good business sense, but also someone who's passionate and kind of creative when it comes to firearms sales and design.
Well, certainly, I would say Graham Anthony was the first of the outsiders.
Okay.
And that's really, Stone was one of the last of the insiders. There were a couple other examples that I'll mention later, but for the most part, we're starting to pull people that have no firearms background. And really, if you look at most industries, you can see that dividing point of you have the people who the company is named after, and maybe that lasts one or more generations after the founder. But after that, then it's all outsiders, and that's where you see sort of the soul of the company change for the worse, because the people making the decisions aren't necessarily listening to the salespeople. They're not necessarily listening to the manufacturing people. As a matter of fact, they may not even have a clue as to what's right and what's wrong.
Right.
So, and as you mentioned, Daniel, it seems like Stone was aware of that, and he was trying to promote from within, but they all died.
Yeah, that's right. There wasn't really anybody left that he felt could take the company where it needed to go.
And once Anthony took over, it kind of was a tumultuous time for Colt, as is kind of a common theme in their history. So what happened sort of after the war kind of ended, and surprisingly they were kind of losing money on the war?
Right, and they continued to lose money. I mean, they lost money not just at the tail end of 43. They lost money every year, 44, 45, 46. And matter of fact, there's even allegations that they didn't really even produce anything in 46, at least not for the first 6 or 9 months of the year. And so if President Anthony, coming from the outside, hadn't already alienated the older employees, Anthony's choice for his executive vice president in 46, that pretty much stuck a fork in it, so to speak. It was followed by the name of Benjamin Franklin Connor. It was Connor's family's business that was the basis for Colt's plastic division. That was the company that was bought out in 1920. And so it looks like Connor was pretty heavy-handed as to how he treated the firearms employees once he became executive VP. Anthony was sort of taking a hands-off view as far as the company was concerned, and so day-to-day operations were pretty much on Connor's back. And it looks like Connor was trying to run off of any potential competitors that would succeed Anthony as company president when Anthony's 5 years ran out. Matter of fact, lo and behold, when Anthony left in 1949, boom, Connor became president. And Colt was also faced at the end of the war with trying to rebuild its commercial firearms production lines and tooling and fixtures that for designs that weren't being made during the war. Again, you have things like the Single Action Army, the News Service, some of the others were evidently damaged during the war because they hadn't made any real effort to properly store them. I know there was one rumor that basically said they'd taken the tooling and fixtures out to the parking lot and just left them in the open air to rust away. Now, that might be an exaggeration, but obviously if they're trying to expand the plant for military contracts, there's no real room to keep the civilian products that don't have a military analog. And so really the company kind of limped along during 47, 48, and 49. They're only making profits of just over $100,000 a year. But there was an attempt by financial speculators to try to take over the company. I want to say that was about 48 or 49. And what happened was in 1950, Colt decided, okay, we're going to buy these people out just to keep them from making trouble. And this cost them another about $6.5 million from the cash reserves. Well, this is about the time the Korean War started. So there were, again, more military contracts. And this, again, brought up their sales, brought up their back orders. But again, as soon as the war ends, boom, the spigot gets turned off. It doesn't matter how many back orders you once had. Once the military decides its contract is over, your contract's over, and that's it. Well, in 55, you had another series of corporate raiders. You had Burton Bartlett and Chester Bland, who bought their way into the board of directors. Bartlett quickly replaced Benjamin Connor with his associate Chester Bland as company president. There's allegations of a lot of shady dealings going on at that time. And they were basically looking to make a quick profit by turning around and trying to sell the company to someone else. And the person they ended up looking towards was a fellow by the name of Leopold Silberstein, who had a holding company called Penn, Texas. Now, Silberstein was a German immigrant. He had left Germany itself in the early 30s due to their anti-Semitic fever of that era, of the Nazi era. He eventually made it to England before the war started, came to the U.S. after the war, had about $150,000 in his pocket, and just started buying up companies right and left, basically leveraging deals. And so he'd put together a fairly sizable number of companies that he had in his pocket. And one of the companies that he went after around that time had been Pratt & Whitney, which was one of Colt's neighbors in Hartford. And so Silverstein bought his way in and almost immediately replaced Chester Bland with a fellow by the name of Sidney Stewart, who had been vice president of Pratt & Whitney's Chandler and Evans division. However, Silverstein also installed his own son, Charles, as an executive vice president. And Silverstein basically started alienating people almost immediately. He started liquidating Colt's non-firearms division. He liquidated the company's museum collection. He donated it to the Connecticut State Library. And while that was considered a charitable act, it was really probably more of a tax write-off at the time. And Silverstein got probably a well-deserved reputation as being, someone that bled companies dry. But his control of Colt was pretty short-lived. And in 1957, Silverstein was trying to take over yet another company by the name of Fairbanks Morse. And it turns out that Fairbanks Morse was quite a bit, I don't know the proper word for it, but they were far more talented in resisting Silverstein's advances and games. And what happened was Silverstein failed in his attempt to take over the company, and this left him very overextended financially. And ironically, Fairbanks Morse ended up buying out Silverstein. Not just Silverstein, but Penn, Texas as well, including Colt and Pratt & Whitney. And so the resulting conglomerate in 1958 became Fairbanks Whitney. And Fairbanks Whitney and its successor, Colt Industries, essentially they were the owners of Colt through the late 80s. Matter of fact, Fairbanks Whitney changed its name to Colt Industries in 1964, basically to capitalize on the name recognition of the firearms company. So after the ouster of Silverstein, you had one of the first insiders elected company president. And this was in 1958. It was Colt's vice president and sales director, Fred Roth. With Fred Roth becoming president, Sidney Stewart became chairman of the board of directors. And Roth was he was pretty on the ball as to the market. He undoubtedly had a hand in working the deal that acquired the rights to the Armalite AR-15 from Fairchild. Certainly the deal was finalized under his presidency. He also saw Colt's popularity for the single-action army, particularly with the popularity of cowboy programs and movies and on television. And he probably had a hand in the reintroduction of the single-action army back when he was sales director. And actually, Roth would show up at fast draw contest, or at least the national contest, to promote Colt's interest. And Roth continued on as president until 1962. And at that time, he was replaced by a fellow by the name of David Scott. And David Scott had been hired by Fairbanks Whitney from the outside to become a group manager. And that group included, again, Colt, Chandler Evans, and Pratt & Whitney. Scott's major contribution during his presidency in 1963 was hiring a fellow by the name of William Goldbach as vice president of operations. And for those that are fans of the M14, they'll recognize the name Goldbach because he was the one that set up TRW's M14 production line, which was considered rather high-tech and miraculous for its era compared to many of the other M14 contractors of the time.
Well, and one of the things you're going to find here coming up is really the repetition of the war has started. Colt now gets a good contract. They work on the contract, and then the war ends, and their sales drop off again. Exactly.
I mean, Scott's successor at the company, Paul Binke, again outside the company, but the M16 contract the Major Army M16 contract was signed in late '63. And you had follow-on contracts that just kept expanding as the U.S. involvement in Vietnam really took off in 1965. And so there was a major sales and profits expansion. So in 1969, Binky was, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but he was promoted within the parent Colt Industries. And he was to head up the newly formed Firearms Group, because Colt was at the time divided up into separate civilian and military arms divisions, much like what would happen in the early 2000s. At that time, Gordon Walker became president of the Civilian Arms Division, and then William Goldbach was named the Military Arms Division president. Of course, Goldbach had the unfortunate luck that this is right when U.S. military involvement in Vietnam was about to take a nosedive. And so, of course, with military involvement in Vietnam going down, so did the military orders. And this ended up with Goldbach leaving Colt in 1972. During the same period, the conflicts with organized labor really started to spike again. After Colt licensed production of the M16 family to the U.S. government in 1967, Colt's employees decided, hey, this is a great time we'll do a 5-week walkout to protest this decision to second source the M16 family, which of course proves the government's point that they needed a second source production facility just in case Colt's employees went out on strike. And then there was another minor walkout in 1969, which was related to an increase in delivery rates for the M16 rifle. The company was having to bring in supervisors on weekends just to get enough rifles delivered to the government. And so the employees decided, this is as good a time as any let's go out on strike again. And their union representatives proceeded to then turn this into a company-wide walkout for a period of 2 weeks. It looks at the time that they were probably trying to increase their leverage ahead of 1970s or a contract renegotiation in 1970. And there was yet another walkout in 1973, which lasted 5 months. And at the time, there had been rumors that Colt had bought a parcel of land in New Mexico and might try to relocate the company. So, of course, they decide, oh, hey, this is a good time to prove the company's point that we need to leave Connecticut. Let's walk out for another 5 months. Well, at least after 73, they were able to negotiate at least 3 more union contracts without a strike. It was barely avoided in 82, but coming into 85, the union rejected the proposed contract. They stopped a walkout early on because they were afraid that, again, Colt was going to use this as an excuse to leave Connecticut. But for whatever reason, they decided in January of 86, okay, fine, boom, we're out of here. And this is a strike that lasted roughly 4 years. And the length of the strike, the violence involved, it ultimately it more than likely had a huge deal to do with Colt losing its follow-on contract for the M16A2 in 1988 to FN Manufacturing in South Carolina.
I think that's probably a safe bet.
Yeah, it's more than a safe bet, I would say. And this is also what led the parent company Colt Industries that they were going to cut the firearms division loose. They were tired of it. They didn't want to deal with the union. They didn't want to deal with the decline in sales and all the other issues. And so they announced this in April of 1989. Well, turns out the National Labor Relations Board decides to rule in favor of the striking workers later that year in September. And so this kind of pushed the ball rolling. And eventually a deal was worked out in March of 1990 with a variety of investors, including the state of Connecticut and the UAW being granted partial ownership of the company. It was also an agreement to pay back wages to all of the returning strikers. So basically, you've been off the job for 4 years. Oh, hey, by the way, you're going to get paid for all that time. Another issue with the return of the strikers was all the replacement workers that had been hired during those 4 years. Bam, you're fired. Bye. And this was a pretty ugly era as far as Colt's reputation for quality control, because again, you basically had a bunch of replacement workers that didn't have a good grasp on necessarily what they were doing. And, it's kind of on-the-job training for a lot of the classic Colt designs. I know I linked an article to Nathaniel, which showed a King Cobra that was made during this era that somehow escaped the factory without any rifling in the barrel.
Sure.
That may cause some accuracy issues.
Yeah. It's like, how do you miss that during your quality control inspection?
Mm-hmm.
But at any rate, with all of this expense from the strike, particularly paying back wages, it ended up this pushed the company into bankruptcy in 1992. Another weird thing that happened with the privatization of the company in 1990 was that all of the company's intellectual property was sold to a separate set of investors. So the firearms company basically had to pay royalties for the rights to make its own products and to use its legacy trademarks.
That's bizarre.
Yeah. So the Chapter 11 proceedings that followed the bankruptcy in 92 were really dragged out. And some of the potential buyers at the time they wanted to buy the factory, but they were really hesitant because they were worried that they wouldn't be able to use Colt's intellectual property because of its ownership by the separate group of investors. And I know there were a couple that, they'd made the deal to buy one but not the other. And the fact that they couldn't close both soured the deals. What ended up happening was there was an investment firm by the name of Zilka and Company, and I may be mispronouncing the poor fellow's name, but he came to the rescue in September of 1994, and he had enough money to buy out both the factory and the intellectual property rights. And the fellow at Zilka and Company was the name of Donald Zilka, and this became his pet project. At the time, he was telling basically anyone who would listen that he had dreams of consolidating the entire firearms industry under one roof. He was going to make it a serious, respectable industry. And so this was the same period of time that Colt made purchases of Saga Defense in Maine. They also bought up Ultralight Arms in West Virginia. I know that's a pet company of Richard Mann. They also tried to buy out Fabrique Nationale, and I probably mispronounced that too, but we'll call it FN. Well, their attempts to buy FN failed in 1997. The government of the Walloon region in Belgium decided they didn't really want the Americans owning their company, so they ponied up the money to buy FN from the French conglomerate Giat.
I think it should be noted that the early 90s was not a very good time for FN, so that's why Colt could consider doing that.
I was going to say, because I mean, there was speculation back when Colt was kind of having its troubles that perhaps FN would buy Colt.
Right. I mean, right now, FN's a really strong company, but at the time, they had just had the BRG-15 contract go through. They had basically no money, and I think they were in bankruptcy, but Daniel can correct me on that if I'm wrong.
Well, and realistically, FN's been doing a better job at the stuff Colt used to do a good job at.
Yeah.
Well, again, FN had been in very bad financial straits, and they'd actually been bought out by that French conglomerate I'd mentioned. I say the correct spelling is Giat. But at the time, the French decided they were going to push FN out on its own, and so that's when the Belgian government came to the rescue and thwarted Colt's advances. Well, again, the late 1990s, it was kind of an ugly time for the gun industry, particularly in the U.S. You had the threat of local lawsuits. You had the threat of federal lawsuits, particularly the Housing and Urban Development was making noises about basically suing the gun industry into bankruptcy. And at that time, Zilka's enthusiasm began to wane. And Colt was even talking about ending their entire commercial handgun line in 1999. And Zilka's business partner, by the name of John Regas, he started pushing for a spinoff of Colt's military division as a separate company. And just in time for the War on Terror, Colt Defense was established in 2002. However, Regas had his own investment firm, Signs Capital Management, and they ended up buying up a controlling interest in Colt Defense. And it looks at the beginning, Signs meant to take Colt Defense in a public IPO on the stock exchange, hoping to make a quick turnover in funding. But this IPO failed and was withdrawn in 2005. And during this time, it looks like Signs was essentially starting to milk Colt Defense. And they were siphoning funds back into their own coffers by charging Colt consulting fees, distributions. With the breakup of Colt Defense and Colt Manufacturing, you also saw Colt's IP getting spun off again into a separate holding company. And again, this is just another way to burn money. But the company was brought back together again just a few years ago in 2012, again, under the control of Science Capital Management. And that's basically where we are today with, again, Science was basically taking out loans, taking out bonds in order to pay the interest off of earlier loans and bonds. And again, certainly the bondholders, or at least the other creditors of Colts, are now have their knives out for Signs, trying to keep them from using bankruptcy as a way of erasing all the bad debt that they had taken on.
Well, and the thing is, I mean, if you look at it, it's kind of been like a cycle of really good times for Colt, really bad times for Colt. And in the background, while all this stuff is going on with the management and with the different companies and different entities that are contracting with them, you have Colt going on with various projects like the Scamp, the Imp, the Mars, the CMG, some of them being somewhat successful, but the majority of them being not really successful at all.
Well, I think this is going to be kind of Nathaniel's pet project here. Certainly there's no lack of ideas going on the manufacturing side, on the R&D side. Certainly there's some wishy-washiness on the sales side, but
right,
it's trying to get it all past management. It's either, again, there's so many outsiders in management that the ones that do care about trying to run a profitable business don't really have a clue on what the market wants.
And I remember being a kid and going on looking for Colt on the internet and seeing two different websites, one for Colt Defense and one for Colt Commercial. And I couldn't see any guns, and I couldn't even access the military website, I believe. And it really seemed like they had separated their businesses. And that's kind of a theme that I notice, in you talking about it. It seems like the management was very disconnected from the firearms development and creativity of the company. So you would have people on one side of the company designing guns, and that was their main focus, and that was what they were concerned with. And then on the other side of the company, you had a group of people who all they cared about was how much money they could get out of the company.
Right, and certainly that's the case with Zoka, definitely the case with Regas. Again, that whole episode in the late 90s, particularly with the potential federal lawsuits, was making them extremely wary. And publicly they were basically saying, well, we're really making these guns for law enforcement and military. It seems like they saw the commercial side of it, the civilian side of it, as being almost distasteful. And they would just as soon be rid of it.
Right, and it seems like, especially back when I was looking at them, it seemed like there wasn't even a civilian side. I couldn't find any information on any guns they were making, and I honestly thought they had stopped making firearms for the civilian market.
Well, certainly that rumor of 1999, well, it really wasn't a rumor. They'd publicly come out and talked about the possibility of ending the commercial handgun line in 99. And so, part of the excuse they made for separating the company in 2002 was to limit the liability. They figured if someone was going to go down, they could always just sacrifice the commercial manufacturing division, or Colt's manufacturing company, and that way the military side, Colt Defense, would be safe for many of the potential lawsuits.
Now, starting in kind of on the projects that they started on in the background of the whole Colt saga, there were a few projects, and one that I actually recently had experience with, the CMG, so the Colt machine gun family. And it's pretty interesting because at the time that this gun was designed, you had stuff like the M60 hadn't quite come into being, if I'm not mistaken, right, Daniel?
It existed. Matter of fact, it was just really being introduced.
Okay.
It was officially adopted in 1957. There were still some teething issues even into the early 60s, but yes, it was an issue item at the time. But it was a brand new world as far as far as a 5.56 machine gun.
Right. And we were moving into that whole concept, and recently I met up with Ian from Forgotten Weapons, and I got to see the CMG3, of which there's only, I believe, one now that exists, the one that we saw. And they had also made a similar firearm in 5.56. And you had stuff like the Stoner 63, which was another example of a light machine gun that was convertible between many different roles. And I feel like that was kind of a concept that they were trying to introduce with many different designs, and the M60 and 308 or 7.62 was the one that really took hold. But they were trying many different designs at the time.
So the concept of a lightweight machine gun was something that I think, especially after World War II, especially like the M60, comes sort of inspirationally directly from the German World War II MG42 machine gun. And once 5.56 is introduced, sort of one of the next leaps that people start thinking about is, well, what if we do a belt-fed machine gun? And pretty much, as far as I can tell, the very first of those was the Stoner 63. The CMG 1 and then the CMG 2 coming sort of after that, and then the CMG 3 being the larger 7.62 millimeter version. The CMGs are a really interesting family from a just conceptual standpoint, because they incorporate a lot of features that are generally regarded as being good design features if you want a high reliability but relatively lightweight mechanism. They have an anti-pre-engagement mechanism which prevents the bolt from creating friction in the receiver. They have two guide rods that the bolt rides on, so the bolt doesn't move around a lot when it's cycling, but there's a lot of clearances in the action. They were actually controlled round feed, which is one of the very, very, very few controlled round feed fully automatic weapons out there. And they were really on the cutting edge of 5.56 belt-fed machine guns. I mean, it was literally like the Stoner 63 was the only one that existed at the time. So
right. Well, and at the time we were coming. It wasn't so much. It wasn't not only just an actual physical firearm, but it was a concept too. Because I mean, you look at World War II, the concept of a light machine gun. I mean, the lightest you could really think of would be the BAR, and even then, you only got a 20-round box magazine of 30-06 full-power rifle ammo.
Right,
so you have limited effectiveness because of that magazine capacity, and then your next step up is the 1919, I believe, right?
Right, and so with the whole 5.56 light machine gun, it really is a different animal. It's a different animal for two reasons. As you mentioned, the machine gun itself is usually physically lighter, at least to some degree, than something like a BAR, which, as you mentioned, is one of the lightest automatic rifles or light machine guns they have at the time. And also, the ammunition is about half the weight of 7.62, which means that whereas with something like an M240 or something like an M60 or even some of the lighter 7.62 millimeter machine guns, the weight of the weapon is important, but the weight of the ammunition is even more dramatic, because you really need a second guy to carry ammunition for you. The 5.56 light machine guns were different in that they really didn't. You could carry enough ammunition to have a meaningful amount of firepower in your light machine gun with a 5.56 millimeter light machine gun. So something like the Stoner 63 sees a lot of use with, obviously, the Navy SEALs. It's very famous for that. But the CMG2 is also designed sort of in this vein. So,
well, the thing to remember is 5.56 ammo is basically half the weight of 7.62 NATO.
Right.
Right.
And so, that's a huge difference when you're trying to carry a whole bunch of it with you on your person.
Right. And if you don't have separate ammunition bearers, which most machine gun teams, most 7.62 millimeter machine gun teams they pretty much have to have ammunition bearers, because one guy can't carry enough 7.62 millimeter to be very combat effective.
Right.
And so you could if you were like the Hulk, but you're right. But not in a normal organizational sense. You just don't get that many people who are 7 feet tall and can carry 500 rounds of 7.62 NATO. And so with the 5.56 machine guns, this is something that the Army would sort of eventually catch on to. Obviously, they fielded the M249, but that was a later development. With the CMG2 and the Stoner 63, those two guns were really ahead of the pack in terms of this, and the Stoner 63 in particular would go on to have a really long service history with special forces, particularly the SEALs. The CMG2 was another very promising design that in a lot of ways I think was better than the Stoner 63. It lacked the modularity concept the Stoner 63 had, but it was probably more reliable. It had some early design issues, like the receivers had an area that they cracked and some things like that, but nothing that to me seemed like insoluble. But from a mechanical standpoint, they should have been very reliable, and I would be surprised if they were. I would not be surprised to find that they were more reliable than a Stoner 63. Those reportedly needed to be babied pretty hard.
Well, and one of the things, granted, I haven't handled the CMG2 in 5.56, but I handled the CMG3 in 7.62, and it was surprisingly light. And watching Ian shoot it from the shoulder, basically unsupported, it had that foregrip, and the rear grip was the one that was how you charge the bolt. Mm-hmm. And it was surprisingly controllable for a 308. And the other thing was the magazine was really well designed. It didn't have any spring assist, so it didn't like force the belt up into the action. But it did have a little tiny spring clip at the top of the magazine well where the rounds come out, which prevented the belt from falling back into the drum. So I'm not sure of the capacity of the drum, but it seemed like a really good design.
Yeah, the sort of external drums have been tried several times, and you eventually ended up with basically a variant of that on the 240, where you ended up with the built-in box on the 240. The Russians fielded, obviously, drums for the RPD and machine guns like that. And so that was a very good concept that had been proven out already by that point in other firearms that existed, just weren't American.
Right.
Obviously, the Stoner 63 also had a box. So it was a concept that had been around in other places in the world, and I think it was a good design. The CMG2 was clearly meant as more of a mobile machine gun than something like the M60. If you look at the charging handle as the pistol grip, this is kind of a funky idea. We think of that as being kind of a funky idea nowadays, but it actually makes a lot of sense. Machine guns. Yep.
I had several people say to me, when I showed them that image, they were like, how is that intuitive? And I said, well, you guys think a Kel-Tec KSG is an intuitive thing. It's basically the same thing. Put a foregrip on it. It feels like the same thing, except in the Kel-Tec's case, you're doing the foregrip back towards your hand. It's basically the reverse.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems is that you have guns, these large guns, and even a lightweight 5.56 millimeter machine gun is still a pretty heavy weapon, and especially when it's loaded up with ammo and all this other stuff. And they're full auto, and they're hard to handle in a lot of cases, and so you have to find sort of workarounds, especially if you want to make something that's belt fed and that's easy to use and mobile. And so you'll notice they have all these things where you don't have to, with the CMG, you don't have to like fiddle around with the feed tray. You pretty much load it and go. You don't have a special procedure that you have to go through so you don't break anything.
Right.
Like
that was one of the things that Ian noted on the CMG3. He was opening up the top cover and someone said, is there a little feeder like on the MG42? And he said, nope, just throw the belt in there and close it and you're ready to go.
Right. So if you're doing this on the move, you really it's not that a soldier couldn't necessarily learn to compensate for something like that, but if you're doing it on the move and you're trying to reload as quickly as possible, having none of those things happen like you would with like an AR-15 or an M14 or something like that, being able to just insert the magazine and go. Belt feds most of the time are not actually like that, but with the CMG, bolt goes home on an empty chamber and doesn't fire around. You open up the top cover, you throw a belt in, you throw it in, you pump the charging handle, and you're good to go. And that's a much, much cleaner design than, I'm out of ammo. Now I have to carefully, place I have to get on the ground, right? I have to get on the ground. I have to carefully place the belt in the feed pawl. I have to, make sure that I'm not putting the feed pawl in the wrong place. I'm closing the top cover, and now I have to reach over with the hand. Again, this is a really heavy gun, so it has to be on the ground basically if I'm going to charge it, because otherwise I'm sort of trying to hold it up here in the front, and now I have to take my other hand off the gun. Now I'm holding 20 pounds worth of gun with my offhand, and now I'm pulling the charging handle back, and it's really inconvenient to do with most belt-fed machine guns, whereas the CMG was clearly designed, whether it ended up working or not, whether it ended up sort of being a system that you could reliably reload on the move, that was clearly what they were going for.
Right. Now, moving on into the different other projects that they did, the CMG, at least to me, probably seems like the most successful one. I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn there, but you had
I think most of the projects that we're going to talk about tonight were actually really promising, and it's really weird that Colt didn't take advantage of them, and I think that's where sort of part of our thesis is coming from.
So how about the IMP? Because a couple of the other projects I'm pretty familiar with, but the IMP, the individual multi-purpose weapon, I have no idea about.
So if you're familiar with like the Bushmaster arm pistol,
yep,
that was it wasn't based on the IMP, but somebody basically saw an IMP and said, "Oh, I want to do that too." The IMP was sort of a precursor to it. It was chambered in a round that was the case was the same as the 221 Fireball, but the bullet was shorter and the overall length was shorter. So you have this really short compact box magazine. The whole pistol grip assembly rotates to the right or to the left, and it's a bullpup design where you sort of don't have to use it like a stocked weapon. It's balanced in such a way and is configured in such a way that you can fire it like a pistol. Sort of like if you've ever seen in Stargate where one of the characters fires P90s with his hand straight out, like in this really goofy way. That was actually how the arm pistol was pretty much designed to be fired. And it was designed as I think mostly as an aircrew weapon. Daniel can back me up on that one. But
right. Yes, the original requirement came from the Air Force.
Yeah. And so it was an interesting design. One of the many PDW type weapons that Colt worked with, and the development started on that in the sort of late mid 60s. I think like 67, something like that. I think they start getting patents for it in 69, 71, and that obviously led to the Bushmaster arm pistol indirectly, where somebody who eventually went to work for Bushmaster. I don't know that much about the development history of the Bushmaster arm pistol. I bet Daniel knows more than I do.
Yeah, I mean, if you want me to jump in here.
Yeah, please do.
Right, the Bushmaster arm pistol was actually first known as the Gwynn arm pistol for Mac Gwynn Jr. Matter of fact, Mac Gwynn Jr. now owns MGI.
Up in Bangor, Old Town.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just north of me.
Yeah, he was actually Army Special Forces during Vietnam. He was an officer, and supposedly he saw one of Dale Davis's demonstrations of the IMP back at Hobart Field, which is right next to Elgin Air Force Base, where Dale Davis worked. Dale Davis was one of the lead people at the Air Force's armament laboratory, and so the design started as a survival weapon for air crews, and it ultimately got the design work. After Davis came up with the basic concept, it was passed on to Colt under contract for them to do more development of it. And that happened around 69 or so. And the person at Colt that worked on it was a fellow by the name of Stanley Silsby. And Silsby was a former Springfield Armory employee who went to Colt after the armory closed. Actually, speaking of Springfield Armory, going back to the CMG-2, the two people that worked on the CMG-2 were George Curtis and Henry Tatro. And again, both of those guys had worked on the M60 at Springfield Armory. Matter of fact, they'd worked on the M60E1, which was an improved design, which had a lot of features that, for whatever reason, the Army decided never to go into production on it. But some of the features were later picked up for the M60E3, which George Curtis worked on for Marymount Saco after leaving Colt. But again, back to the IMP. At the time, there was looks like the original requirement went back to 67. They wanted something that could kill a man at 100 yards. It was sufficiently accurate for the average aircrewman to hit a man at 100 yards. They wanted it to basically be, say, around 13, 15 inches, not more than an inch thick, not over 1.5 pounds. I think the original survival weapon requirement was for it to be semi-automatic and not hold more than 7 rounds. But when they did some more work on the idea, they expanded it out. And I think originally they wanted the IMP to be chambered for an experimental 17 caliber design that Frankfurt Arsenal had been working on.
Yes, this is one that used a Sabo, right?
Well, actually, the original work, I think, was just going to be a pure 17 caliber. Okay. Later, they experimented with the Sabos and the 221 Fireball case.
Okay.
Actually, the IMP was used for a lot of experimental work. It was kind of strange, some of the different things they worked on. I know Remington was working with the Air Force on a hybrid plastic or polymer cartridge case that had a metal head. That was one of the first examples of that being tried. They also played with a 30 caliber version, which was sort of a mini 300 blackout. Matter of fact, I want to say
the actual blackout, the original blackout announcement PDF actually shows that cartridge, and they say this is explicitly one of our inspirations. So,
right. So again, I know Colt worked on it from about 69 to 71. I want to say Mac Gwynn, after he got out of the Army, picked up the rights to it around 73 or so. And so essentially Gwynn Arms, after the Gwynns got out of the business, that's when it became Bushmaster. And I know there was a recent announcement, the current successor to the original Bushmaster Firearms, was it Wyndham?
Yeah, Wyndham Weaponry, yep.
Right. They were talking about they were going to market, I believe, the MGI Hydra lower or something of that nature, or maybe it was their upper. They're talking about the company's long history together. It's like, well, yeah, it all goes back to the arm pistol.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's the thing. They're about 60 miles away from me, so I've got to get up there sometime.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm certain Mac Gwynn has a bunch of interesting stories.
So the moving on from the IMP, the Scamp, and that's the one that I'd heard about a long time ago, and just recently it's kind of made its way into video games. I believe the new Grand Theft Auto kind of has a facsimile of the Scamp, and the whole idea behind it is a pistol to replace the 1911. But sort of like a PDW. It's basically an early PDW concept, wouldn't you say?
Yes, the Scamp's an interesting pistol, as we talked about in the Machine Pistol radio show, which sort of is if you haven't listened to that one yet, please go do, because it's sort of a whole precursor to the Scamp. Engineers all over the world had been trying to figure out how to do controlled full auto firepower in a handheld pistol-sized weapon. And the Scamp is one of the most, conceptually, so far as I can tell, successful examples of that. Now, they made one of them, so obviously it wasn't successful on the market. But it's an interesting design, sort of most closely resembles like a smaller MP7, except it is substantially smaller than the MP7. It's lighter and it's a bit bigger than like a 1911, but still quite a bit smaller than, say, an MP7. But conceptually very similar. It was an interesting mechanism where they had taken basically the internals could be viewed as being similar to a Browning BAR, actually. Which is kind of bizarre for something this small. They used a locking block similar to a Browning BAR. They used a piston that, in this case, was annular, but it sort of rode around the barrel in this sort of internal slide arrangement. And then they had moved the fire control group to the top of the mechanism because they had wanted to move the barrel down as far as possible because this thing is fully automatic. Development starts on this pistol in '69. And their goal appeared to be related to the IMP, where they were going for something that could potentially be an aircrew weapon, but also be a broader sort of personal defense weapon type role, fill that kind of role. And so they started research on this and came up with this mechanism and came up with a prototype. And the prototype, what they determined was they were not going to be able to make a weapon that met these requirements in the 9mm caliber. They just weren't going to be able to. That caliber had too much recoil. They looked at .22 long rifle and determined that didn't have enough lethality for what they were trying to do. They looked at .22 Winchester Magnum rimfire and determined that, and the 5mm Remington Magnum rimfire, and determined that the rimfire on both of those, that priming mechanism was not going to give them what they were looking for. And so what they actually went into was looking at shortened rimless versions of the .22 Hornet. And just so they shortened the case a little bit, they even more aggressively shaped the neck, and they removed the rim. And that became the .22 Scamp, which it's dimensionally very, very similar to the 5.7 by 28 millimeter FN cartridge that would come, 30 years later, but actually was more powerful. It was about a 40 grain bullet at about 2,100 feet per second coming from this pistol-sized package. So a very, very hot round. They considered the Scamp pistol to actually be flexible in terms of the caliber and in terms of, what different kinds of ammunition they could look at. And they went into a bunch of different studies on different kinds of ammunition they could use, necking the round down to 17 caliber, using multiple Flechette loads, which would have been tiny. And they basically stuck with this shortened 22 Hornet type of ammunition. And their project goal for the pistol was to have 3 1/4 pound package, and the actual prototype ended up weighing in at about 3 pounds. So reportedly, it was a very, very successful handgun. With the muzzle brake they had at the end and a 3-round burst mechanism that they had fit into the top of the pistol, like I mentioned previously, reportedly it was a very controllable weapon, even though the rate of fire was really high, about 1,500 rounds a minute. And that, sort of leads one to ask, why didn't the Scamp become successful? Because it was seemingly a step up from something like a 1911. The MP7 has been reasonably successful, and the Scamp appears to be at least competitive with that. So what stopped it? Obviously, Army decided they weren't interested in it for whatever reason. The Army's a bit mercurial on that point.
I actually saw the letter where they rejected Colt's proposal.
Okay.
And the Army basically said, nope, we're not interested. We're already working on a personal defense weapon concept. And at the time, it was the U.S. Army Small Arms Systems Agency, which is an awful acronym, USASA.
Yes.
And but their image of the PDW at the time was they didn't want any full auto versions of it. They were thinking more multiple projectile for a single trigger pull. So it was already an unsolicited proposal, and when the Army rejected it, that was pretty much it.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting that the Army does this routinely, where we have our own internal developments, so we don't want to hear about any alternatives whatsoever. But also, which is a really dumb way to explicitly not harness your own industry, which is neither here nor there. But Colt also didn't sort of shop around to try to see if anybody else was interested in this thing. They just said, well, we tried once. Our first customer wasn't interested. Might as well drop whole development, despite the fact that this is a really promising looking design. So, and we'll see that again and again with some of the other weapons we're going to talk about.
Well, in the Colt Scamp, realistically, out of all the prototypes that Colt put forth, had the most promise, I think.
It was certainly one of the most ambitious ones, and the fact that it was supposed to have worked pretty well is interesting, to be sure. And you look at the fact that similar concepts like the MP7 have actually made it on the market and been successful and made money, and you're sort of sitting here going, well, in 1971 or 72, Colt has something that's equivalent to that, and they don't do anything with it. Come on, man.
Right. Now, the Colt SSP, what was the story with that?
Well, I think at the time Colt was looking at the future of, eventually the Army is going to replace the 45 with a 9mm pistol, and Colt's engineer Rob Roy, he comes up a lot in the M16 story. I think he also had something to do with the CMG1, and the SSP started life around, I want to say about 1970 or so.
It was before 1969.
Oh, it was before 69. Again, I'm just kind of talking off the top of my head. But at any rate, Rob Roy is putting together design. I don't know if you had a chance to look at any of the patents. It's a rather modern design. It's got reversed slide rails. It's got an in-block fire control mechanism, linkless barrel. It's got a disassembly lever. All pretty much features that you did not see on any, certainly not on any American designs of that era. It's way ahead of its time. It's way ahead of the CZ75. Certainly some of the features look like it had been ripped off for the Star Model 28. But for whatever reason, even though they'd been working on it for well over a decade, Colt never bothered to bring it to the commercial market.
And I think it would have totally been one of the first generations of Wonder Nines. I mean, we can't really predict how it would have done, but because it was so ahead of its time, and the market was obviously sort of primed for that, because only a few years later you'd have something like the CC75 come to market, the 92, that sort of thing, become really popular pistols. So.
Well, and you look at, like you said, the other stuff there. I mean, looking at this pistol, it looks like something that was made in the modern day.
Well, again, you look at the U.S. market in the early 70s when this is being prototyped, your only option for a double action, high capacity 9mm pistol was the Smith & Wesson Model 59. And that's it. If you wanted a single action pistol and that's high capacity 9mm, your only option is the high power. And maybe some of the French PA-15s had made it to market, but those would have been extremely, extremely rare. And so, they would have had the market to themselves in the 1970s. Certainly, there was no excuse for them to sit on it in the 1980s when the Wonder 9 revolution finally takes off. They could have been ahead of the game.
Right.
Now, it really seems to me like Colt. There were kind of a few designs that they came across or people designed for them that was really a great design, and they should have continued on with it. But then they ended up, kind of, I don't really feel like that. Now, like the salvo squeeze bore, the one that I'm seeing here on the show notes, is that kind of the whole because of that salvo concept they came up with, like you were talking about earlier, Daniel? Well,
certainly the original Project Salvo of the 1950s. Salvo squeeze bore was a concept dreamed up by a fellow by the name of Russell Robinson. And some folks may recognize his name because during World War II, he had actually developed a shoulder-fired 50 BMG machine gun. It wasn't meant for that purpose, but it was originally meant to be a 50 BMG that was small enough that could replace 30 caliber machine guns like the Browning 303s. In the wings of British aircraft. And so Robinson had lots of interesting ideas, but just never seemed to be able to successfully bring any of them to market. And the salvo squeeze bore, looks like he was playing with that in the early 60s with Armalite, the forgotten Armalite 13 or AR-13 was a Robinson design, basically multiple barrels with salvo squeeze bore rounds inside of them. I know DARPA, it would have been ARPA at the time, Advanced Research Projects Agency, was playing with the salvo squeeze bore ammunition that Robinson had provided in M2 50 BMGs in Vietnam as early as either either 62 or 63. And ultimately, Colt picked up the concept, and they were playing with it in a variety of designs. They're playing with in the M2 50 BMG. They were playing with it in rifles. They were also playing with it in 9mm, and I put a link up to some of their 9mm experiments, which included the SSB pistol, or it would have been the M1971 at the time. There was even talk of them working a deal with IMI in Israel to do salvo squeeze bore barrels for the Uzi.
It's really interesting, the stuff. It kind of seems like at points they were coming up with designs that were based, like you said, though. I mean, they're trying different things and kind of throwing stuff at the wall and see what sticks.
Right. And again, for those that aren't familiar with the salvo squeeze bore concept, it's basically a multiple projectile cartridge design that has the projectiles stacked one ahead of each other. And there's a bore adapter at the end of the rifled barrel that ends up squeezing the whole package down. And as the package of multiple projectiles is squeezed down, they actually separate out. So, like I want to say the 50 caliber version was squeezing them down to 30. I think the 9mm also squeezed them down to 30. They're playing with a variety of different of calibers there. But again, that's a way of getting multiple projectile hits with one squeeze of the trigger.
Now, Colt also was really pushing for the PDW role kind of before a lot of people kind of understood the PDW concept. We had the MP5 and everybody was all about submachine guns. We hadn't really moved into the PDW phase as of yet. And they had stuff like the MARS, the Mini Assault Rifle System. Now, What about the Mars made that an interesting concept that Colt had tried, and ultimately, why did it fail?
Right, so this one was a lot later than some of the other ones that we're talking about. We were talking about, the Scamp and the Imp, which are from the late 60s and 70s, and this is from actually the late 90s. So actually after the FNP 90, but sort of contemporary to like the MP7, that kind of thing. The Mars was one of the first that I know of the really compact AR-15 based rifle systems. We obviously have things like the MCX now, and we have things like the AAC Honey Badger, which are compact. Sort of, they're designed for things like 300 blackout, and they're designed to be sort of low observable with suppressors and that sort of thing. The Mars was not exactly that same kind of concept, but it could have easily gone in that direction, and it's interesting for that reason. It's a similar configuration to some of the early Colt CAR-15 rifles that had been carbines that had been purchased by like special operations and that sort of thing, but it's chambered for a much shorter cartridge than 5.56, actually based on 5.56 22 caliber, but with a case only 30 millimeters long as opposed to 45. So that means that it had performance out of the Mars's 10.5 inch barrel that was roughly comparable to 5.56, despite having a much smaller case, but that allows the action to be much, much shorter. And the rifle itself only weighed about 5.2 pounds. They made a bunch of modifications to it to get it to work and to fix the out-of-battery firing mechanism that the full-size guns have, which is basically a dimensional tolerance that prevents the gun from firing when out of battery. It's how the firing pin doesn't protrude when the bolt's not in battery like it should be. With the shorter action, they had some problems with that, and they had to fix that. But it worked pretty well. It was a gun that had a lot of promise, and the Israelis were interested in it as a replacement for their Uzis and M1 and M2 carbines in the late 90s. And reportedly the Israelis actually signed up to buy 2,000 of these guns a year for 10 years, which is a 20,000 gun contract, and Colt just decided not to, which is bizarre. Is another one of these where they could have marketed it. They had an opportunity to do it. You know that if the Israelis had bought it to replace the Uzi and to replace the M1 and the M2, they probably could have gotten sales from other people if they had marketed it aggressively enough. But Colt, for whatever reason, again, was just not willing to capitalize on this development.
And if they had, we probably today would be saying, "Oh, the Mars." We would know what that is. It'd be a household name.
I think the Mars could have been very successful. With the stock collapse, the thing was less than 2 feet long, which is really short for an AR-15 based rifle. And so it could have really changed the game a little bit. I mean, that's thrown around a lot, but it really could have changed the carbine game, which became a much bigger, much more important part of firearms development in the 2000s, with the M4 carbine being standardized by the Army and most nations moving to shorter and shorter barreled carbines. The Mars could have been ahead of that trend, but Colt just didn't take advantage of it. And even they had a variant of it chambered for the 9x30 Mars, which was based on the 10mm Magnum case. And that, besides having round-nosed bullets, would have had performance similar to like the 300 Whisper. So they could have even been ahead of that trend, which would have been, especially if they put like a suppressor and large subsonic bullets on it, that would have given the U.S. a very short gun that was equivalent to like the Soviet 9x39 millimeter micro assault rifles. So a really strange move on Colt's part to just have something that could have turned into a contract and then not taking advantage of it.
Right. Don't the Soviets call that 9x30 or whatever, the Vintorez or something like that?
One of the weapons.
There's several.
One of the weapons that fires it is the Vintorez. But yeah, the 9x39 is basically a blown out, necked up 7.62x39, firing 366 diameter projectiles like you would have in like a 9.3 Brennecke.
Okay.
And they're subsonic, and they're sort of like a larger 300 Blackout, roughly.
Right. There's a whole family of designs. Some are basically aimed towards sniping, some for assault use, some really super compact versions for basically concealment, bodyguard types.
Right. You look at the plethora of designs that the Russians have come up with just for the 9x39, and the 9x30 Mars could have been similar in some respect, right? And it's not as powerful a cartridge, not as big of a cartridge, but you still could have had a whole line of development come off of that, and Colt failed to exploit any of it.
Now,
Strange.
Now, the last gun we have here in the lineup is one that I remember, I believe, seeing on Tales of the Gun on the History Channel when I was a kid. The Smart Gun, the Colt Smart Gun. And it had a little tiny little antenna that kind of came out the grip tang, if I'm remembering correctly.
Right. It was an electrical system. It was part of a federal grant that Colt had signed into. And it was going to be, again, a user proprietary firearm that if the firearm got too far away from the electronic transmitter, it literally would not work. And matter of fact, there's a picture of Colt's vice president of engineering by the name of Douglas Overbury showing it off to Representative Pat Schroeder from Colorado. And he's basically holding it off in his opposite hand, showing that was far enough away to make it not work because it was out of range of the transmitter. And this whole project caused a lot of ill will in the gun community, at least in the pro-gun community, because they saw it as selling out to anti-gun forces. Certainly Pat Schroeder was never a friend of gun owners. And particularly with the announcement of Colt possibly discontinuing civilian pistol production, it sent a lot of people over the edge as far as how they felt about Colt. Again, this was the whole time, particularly getting close to when Smith & Wesson would end up signing their agreement with Housing and Urban Development to...
what do they call it now? The Hillary hole, the lock on the Smith & Wessons?
Oh, it was worse than that. Well, yeah, that whole agreement to try to head off the HUD lawsuit was really insidious, and certainly Colt was going down that route too. And if the backlash by gun owners against Smith & Wesson hadn't been as bad as it was, you probably would have seen Colt sign on to it as well. But the whole issue with the Smart Gun was the basic design, what they were calling the law enforcement pistol. It was a modern 40 caliber polymer frame pistol, and they never brought it to market. I mean, not even in a non-Smart Gun version. And, that's during the era when Glock owns the polymer pistol 40 caliber market, and they just basically said, "Oh, screw it. We don't want any piece of that until we can put the Smart Gun technology on it."
Yeah,
another bizarre failure to take advantage of what they've clearly got going for them. And this over and over again with Colt, you see this. It's a little frustrating, frankly.
It seems really interesting too, because that pistol, looking at it, him holding it up there, without the Smart Gun technology, it might have been a competitive offering from Colt.
Right, and again, we just don't know because that entire design just never brought it to market. It looks like in some of the patents, they're also showing their odd little co-production design that they did with CZ out of Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic, what they were calling the Z40 pistol. Again, they briefly brought it to market and then decided, no, enough of that. And just, again, it's very odd. I know a lot of Colt fans talk about how, Colt sells everything that they make. And it's like, Well, yeah, but everything you make can be had from just about every other firearms company in America nowadays. And so, there really isn't anything that Colt makes that isn't their own unique design that's, uniquely Colt's anymore.
Yeah. And I sort of feel like I hear a lot from my commenters as I've been covering the Colt bankruptcy. I hear a lot from my commenters. Well, if they would just innovate, which is like from the product side, I know exactly what they're talking about, but it's not that Colt doesn't innovate. It's that they don't take advantage of the innovations they actually make.
Or the opportunities they have.
We've just listed up. This is not even all of the things we could have talked about. We just talked about, 5 or 6 guns that all could have been successfully marketed. And Colt never took advantage of them. Colt basically either laid down and accepted that they just weren't gonna get anywhere with it, or they didn't they got the opportunity for a contract and didn't jump on that, didn't see that as like a first offering. They just were like, oh, well, that's not enough to justify production, which is silly. I mean, your first order is for 20,000 guns, and you're saying that's not enough to, to justify a potential market offering when you're selling it to the Israelis. This sort of thing is just bizarre. And so I think what I would convey to people is that there's something wrong with the management of Colt that doesn't really have to do with their engineers not being creative enough. It doesn't really have to do with, maybe their manufacturing. Clearly there was the era where their manufacturing was not up to snuff because their quality control was terrible. But in general, their manufacturing is good. They make a lot of their own, almost all of their own stuff in-house, which is something a lot of the other companies don't do. But their management just can't take advantage of a good thing. They don't know a good thing when they see them. They don't know how to seize the day. And yes, we are going to sell the Mars to the Israelis. Yes, we are going to try and sell the scamp abroad. Why not?
Right.
And when they do introduce a new product, it's oftentimes half-baked. I mean,
we're going to talk about the All-American 2000 now.
Such a good prototype that was kind of mucked up.
Yeah, I mean,
that's what Reed Knight claims. We don't actually know, but
it was Gene Stoner's design as well. So, right, and a lot of people blame the lawyers for coming in and making a lot of the changes to the All-American 2000. Another example would be, say, the Colt Double Eagle, which was sort of a warmed-over version of the old C-Camp conversion or double-action conversion, which was first on the market in the 1970s, and Colt brings out their version in the late 80s. Certain of their designs, like the Mark III revolvers, come out with centered internal parts. I mean, this is pre-MIM, but it doesn't win them any friends, and it's way too late for them to recapture the law enforcement market in revolvers. Basically, they had nothing in .44 Magnum for, say, 3.5 decades until they come out with the Anaconda. And
so I think the takeaway from that is too little, too late. They capitalized on too little of their own IP, and what they did bring to market tended to either be too late or kind of stillborn in the case of the All-American 2000, where it really wasn't a gun that people wanted to buy.
Right, especially at the time it was introduced.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Well, I didn't think you had it in you.
I'm your Huckleberry. Why, Johnny Ringo, you look like somebody just walked over your grave.
Fight's not with you, Holiday.
I beg to differ, sir. We started a game we never got to finish. Play for blood, remember?
I was just fooling about.
I wasn't. Say when. Show Johnny Ringo who's boss with Patriot Patch Company's Huckleberry Patch, a must-have for any range bag. Pre-order yours today at patriotpatch.co.
So I can't thank you guys enough for coming on the show. I really, really appreciate it. I think it's going to be a great discussion. People are going to really enjoy actually hearing about what happened with Colt, because I'm sure they've seen on their Facebook feeds over the past few years, Colt's doing this, Colt's doing that, and they maybe haven't decided to read through the articles, but actually hearing the whole progression from where they were just after World War I up until the present day is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, I think that the Colt is a really good firearms company if they would just kind of get their act together and capitalize on what they've got going for them. So
absolutely. So where can people find your articles, Nathaniel?
I write for the firearmblog.com as Nathaniel F. And I also maintain a website, I don't update it very often, called 196,800 Revolutions Per Minute. If you can't remember that, we have a link in the show notes. So
excellent. And Daniel, where can people find you?
Well, the majority of my articles are published online by Dean Spear over at thegunzone.com. Certainly you can find me commenting at the Firearm blog and also on Facebook.
And also you have, I believe it's the 556 Chronicles on Facebook?
Yes, the 556 timeline, a chronology of development. Again, that's basically my public face on Facebook for the timeline that's hosted over at the Gun Zone.
Awesome, and there'll be a link to that in the show notes. So thank you guys again.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
Thanks for having us on.
Gun Guy Radio says thank you and proudly displays artwork and graphics designed by Ryan Cross of Hunter of Design. hunterofdesign.com.
So that about wraps up this episode of Gun Guy Radio. Remember to subscribe to us on iTunes so that you never miss a show. And please leave us a review there as well, gunguyradio.com/iTunes. Please consider joining the NRA and the Second Amendment Foundation. There are links there in the show notes. And don't forget to check out the other shows on the Firearms Radio Network. Also, be sure to check out the Patriot Patch Company, started by FRN's own Jake Challand and Ryan Cross. Patriot Patch Company offers high-quality 3D PVC vinyl patches with Velcro backing that is sure to satisfy any taste. Their new I'm Your Huckleberry patch is available for pre-order and is a personal favorite. Patriot Patch Company is also running a pre-order right now on the Firearms Radio Network t-shirts, which are really high quality. I can't wait to get mine. And the Patriotic Flag Patch 4-pack. Be sure to check them out at www.patriotpatch.co. This is Ryan Machad, and I'll see you next week.
This has been a production of the Firearms Radio Network. You can find more information at firearmsradio.tv. Freedom. How does one maintain freedom? That's a question our founding fathers pondered over 200 years ago. They believed the solution was in our Constitution and its amendments. We exercise the freedom of speech every day here at FRN, along with the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Preserving freedom. We believe the Second Amendment could possibly be that one amendment that protects all the rest. Help us to preserve America as a shining light on the hill. We do our part by providing entertainment and information that supports the Second Amendment every day. Preserving freedom. What do you believe? Get involved. Show your support at patreon.com/FRN.